So yeah, I suppose the majority of pure wrestling is made up of tag team matches that aren't that interesting to watch. It's what gets these promotions through their schedule. It's their way of getting content onto their platforms. Fine. It's not always my cup of tea, but I will say that Stardom is one company where I don't mind it as much as, say, a New Japan Pro Wrestling or a Pro Wrestling Noah. Joshi wrestling in general has always caught my eye as a fan that grew up almost exclusively under the impression that women's wrestling is the sexy in between parts of the show. I started watching wrestling consistently back in 2008, right around the time that WWE were cutting back on lingerie battle royals featuring women like Kelly Kelly, and instead were trying to pass off women like her as highly competitive athletes. See Kelly John Cena esque reign with the WWE Divas Championship in 2011 as one example of that. Women in WWE were still being treated as far less than the men. There was no way in hell that the best possible match that they could put on at the time with the women, think maybe Beth Phoenix versus Natalia, could ever main event a monthly pay-per-view on cable TV and not the WWE network, where pretty much anybody could main event these days. Hell, and for even as much praise as you could give TNA's women's division back in 2009, they were still selling sex as a way to get people to pay attention, and it wasn't as weird as it is kind of today. Back when Impact would do their one night only pay per view events and it featured an entire one night only event exclusively focusing on women's matches, also known as Knockouts Knockdown, they were still selling the women as sexy and not competitive. That was just the norm all over mainstream pro wrestling back then. Obviously, things started to change when AJ Lee became the face of WWE's women's division back in 2013 to 2014, but the only competition that she had at the time was the Bella Twins, two women that WWE will never stop pushing as the face of the women's revolution, a storyline that WWE pretty much used as an official out for how they treated the women previously, or rather as a cheap way to write their way into making women's wrestling something to take more seriously instead of, I don't know, maybe building their women's division around wrestlers that could do a little bit more than look pretty performing a snapmare like they were doing with the women in NXT before Sasha, Charlotte, and Becky got drafted into their new makeshift revolution. Just about any wrestling fan with any sense at all can tell you that there was no women's revolution in WWE. They just started finally treating their women's roster with a little bit of care for once and patted themselves on the back for it. To this day, it still bothers the hell out of me to see WWE treat women like fucking children, earning their next treat knowing full and damn well that they have all the resources in the world to build the absolute best women's division on earth if they really wanted to. Having their entire women's division line up in orderly fashion on an episode of Raw to tell them on live television that they're getting a Rumble match or a live pay-per-view and gaslighting the hell out of not only the fans, but the women themselves into believing anything other than the reality that WWE weren't the ones responsible for holding back women's wrestling will never not be a blight on the company in my eyes. At the start of last year, I finally gave the Stardom promotion a shot. It had been my only pro wrestling show. It had been on my pro wrestling show bucket list for quite some time, and thankfully I crossed that name off when I did because not only was it a fresh introduction to women's wrestling with some bite, but it was the gateway drug for other Joshi promotions for me to watch like TJPW or Ice Ribbon. With their two Valentine's Day special shows featuring a handful of championship matches that I felt were worth watching, even with all the preliminary matches, I decided to check both of them out. Whatever was in store here couldn't have been all that bad given the card, right? Well, yeah. I mean, neither show here was outright bad, just, average for the most part. For as much as of a fan of Stardom that I am, they typically put out decent shows at best and rarely genuinely good shows from top to bottom, based off of what I've seen from them so far. And what I've seen from them so far has almost exclusively been preliminary events like their New Year's Star shows, which rarely has matches that on it that blows me away. But it does speak to the nature of these Stardom shows as one of the biggest reasons why I stick around, even despite a card mostly made up of matches that weren't exactly meant to be all that great in the first place. Stardom's factions are rich with quality wrestlers and interesting characters with interesting histories and feuds. And because of that, the majority of their shows are a lot more fun than, say, an NJPW show. So yes, while these two Valentine special shows weren't even on par enough to be decent, I still enjoyed both shows a lot more than I would shows similar to these from other promotions. There weren't many matches worth discussing outside of a few, some for good reasons, and one in particular that bothered the hell out of me with the way that it ended, and I think I'll start with that one first just to get it out of the way. Mayu Iwatani versus Unagi Sayaka in match number 3 of Unagi's 7-match trial series. Look, I know that over in Japan, especially, their young boys and girls are typically thrown into the fire, abused constantly by their superiors, and all that other stuff. But at the end of Mayu and Unagi's match, Mayu hit one of the most disgusting dragon suplexes that I have ever seen in my fucking life. And there's no way in hell that Unagi was selling her pain after the match. I'm willing to give Mayu and Stardom the benefit of the doubt in saying that her and Unagi spoke about this spot prior to the match and that she was totally cool and agreeable with taking it. It might have even been her idea, who knows? But all of this as it unfolded reeked of Mayu making Unagi pay her dues by, recklessly hitting a move on her that could have either paralyzed her or ended her fucking life. German suplexes in general are dangerous fucking moves, so seeing Mayu hit a fucking dragon suplex that hard on Unagi was all around fucking scummy and gross, kayfabe or not. Yeah, there's nothing like making a rookie pay her dues, like concussing the living shit out of them, or damn near ending their career on one stupid ass move because you're such a pro. And again, if this was agreed upon by all parties, then fine. Maybe their rookies are treated a little bit better than the young lions in New Japan. That suplex was disgusting to watch either way for so many reasons. It's like, who the fuck do you think you are to take liberties with someone like that in a business where you are being trusted to not kill the person you're working with? It was despicable to watch in a way. Beyond that, the best and the only great match to come out of either show was the Goddess of Stardom Championship match between Maika and Himeka versus Babe Priestley and Konami. Syuri and AZM, as I call her, had a good match for the SWA Undisputed World Women's Championship, and Julia defended her Wonder of Stardom Championship against Starlight Kid in a good match that I hoped would turn out better than it actually did. Just about everything else on the card, on each card for that matter, from the four-way match with Utami, Tom, Julia, and Kamitani to the marvelous wrestling Joshi features, was pretty run-of-the-mill and not very engaging. Still, though, the show overall wasn't bad and reflected Stardom as a promotion as about as accurately as I've seen from them so far. If anything, at least there were a few